My desire for my half-brother caused me a lot of trouble. I knew it was wrong to get close to him, and I didn't want it at all. But something inside me kept telling me it had to happen, and I really didn't feel good. Come and listen to my story and find a solution to this problem of mine. It was an ordinary day. I was standing in the kitchen. I heard my parents close the door and leave the house, and I knew there would be no one home. My parents had gone to offer condolences to some of their relatives, while my half-brother Mason refused to go, saying he had too much schoolwork. It wasn't uncommon to be home alone with Mason, but for some reason, things felt different today. The house was so quiet that even the slightest sound was much louder than it should have been. I, on the other hand, was busy preparing lunch. Lately, however, Mason has been acting a little more distant, but we have never been very close. Especially since our families got married years ago, we have always been strained. I had just finished chopping the vegetables when, as I expected, I heard him descend the stairs with slow, measured steps. He appeared on the doorstep, leaning back. "Hey, Lisa," he said, quite casually, but there was something in her voice that I couldn't understand. "What are you doing?" he asked, and I replied, "Pasta." And he said, "Okay, I just wanted to make sure I was curious," he said. But instead of walking away, he continued to watch me with a strange expression. I could feel his eyes on me as I moved around the kitchen, and it was starting to make me nervous. I asked if everything was okay. Finally, I looked at his face. I saw that expression again that I noticed last week but didn't dare to question. His sense of comedy in me didn't match the pale and dull expression on his face. He turned to me and said, "You look a little nervous." I lied, "I'm fine," and suddenly wished the subject had changed. Mason approached the counter and stood next to me. The smell of perfume sounded stronger and fresher. It was a bit overwhelming in the small kitchen area. She started whispering, "You know, it's just the two of us in the house today." I paused and did not dare to look at his face. Just then, he said again in a hoarse voice, "There are no mom and dad. No one will be able to divide us." "Really?" said I, surprised at how clearly I sounded. But the tension between us was there. The atmosphere had become strangely heavy. I turned off the stove. The dish was almost ready. I hesitated, not knowing exactly what was what. On the one hand, I didn't care, but on the other hand, what I didn't like was that I was wondering what was actually going on. Mason lightly ran his hand over my arm. It was such a gentle touch that it almost hit me. When he got closer, he said in a half-joking tone, "What's wrong with you?" I asked. He suddenly took me in his arms and whispered, "You've been on my mind for a while," he said. The words hung in the air as if they had never been said, and suddenly I realized what had happened. "Mason," I said, "don't even think about it." My voice shook, my eyes darkened, and for a moment I wasn't sure what to do. At that moment, as if he understood the seriousness of the situation, he continued speaking with a rebellious smile on his face. "There are only two of us here. Do you mind asking for something else?" But talking was definitely not what he was thinking of. I stepped back, creating some distance between us. At that moment, it felt as if the kitchen had narrowed and the distance between us became suffocating. His words were playful on the surface, but there was something darker underneath, something that makes me feel like I'm standing on the edge of a cliff. I forced a laugh, trying to compose myself, but my voice came out shaky. "What exactly do you want to talk about?" I said. Mason's eyes lit up with an emotion I couldn't identify, but he didn't immediately respond. Instead, he took a step closer, closing the distance between us. My heart began to beat rapidly and the tension intensified. "Come on," he said in a soft but insistent voice. "Lisa, you know what I mean." I turned around and took the plates I had prepared. His presence felt like a dark shadow behind me. I felt like I had to get out of the kitchen, escape the weight of the moment. "Let me take these to the living room," I muttered, trying to sound casual. I walked without turning around, but I could hear him following me. I put the plates on the coffee table, and Mason sat on the couch and continued to watch me, his eyes never leaving me, as if he was waiting for something I couldn't understand. I sat on the farthest corner of the couch, keeping a safe distance between us. The television was on, but I couldn't pay attention to it. I could feel the weight of his eyes on me. We sat in silence for a while, the faint ticking of the clock on the wall echoing in the background. Each second passed with agonizing slowness. The tension between us was there, unspoken but undeniable. "Have you ever thought," said Mason suddenly, breaking the silence, "what things would be like if we weren't related?" His voice was low, as if he wasn't sure if he was saying the right thing. I felt sick to my stomach. This limit was greatly exceeded. I wondered if what we felt at that moment had any meaning. I questioned whether I could accept it, but I had no answer. How else could I say it? "This is weird," I said, trying to distract myself from these thoughts and tended to my plate, but I still had no appetite. Instead of stepping back, he pressed on. "Yes, it's really strange," he whispered. "After all, we're just half siblings, it's not blood related," as if he'd already made the statement. It turns out he was partially right, but still what he did wasn't right. I finally turned my gaze to him and was surprised by the intense look in his eyes. But he wasn't kidding. Seeing that he was serious was even worse, because even though I didn't want to admit it, it scared me more than I'd ever been. "There's no way we can do this," Mason said, but before I could finish my sentence, "Why not?" he interjected. His voice was soft, almost pleading. "Nobody will know. We are on the right track. We're just talking," he was saying, but I could sense that wasn't his real intention, the real message he was hiding behind the words. I nodded. "Impossible. We are a family now, no matter what," I said. I had built a bridge between me and him, but this bridge could not evolve in any other direction. There was a silent pause between us, but I could still sense the sadness that wasn't reflected on his face. Mason's face appeared before my eyes, standing silently. Mason approached again. "Sometimes I can't get rid of the effect your gaze has on me." "You've obviously never thought about it," he said. I froze. His words were harsher than I expected, because even though I didn't quite understand what he meant, I knew there was some truth to it. I always keep that moment in my mind. He never let me insist, but sitting here with him, these thoughts had now surfaced. "That's enough," I whispered, my voice so hoarse I didn't even know what I was trying to say. As if I wanted him to tell me to stop, or did I want him to tell me to stop? Just then he touched my back, and his touch created a contraction in my back. I hated how my body reacted. I hated retreating at first. "Mason, please," I said, my voice shaking. But he didn't even take a step back. His eyes were locked on me. For a moment I thought he would react more harshly, but then he leaned back on the couch and sighed deeply. "You are so angry," he said, and took his hand off my body. Afterwards, "I'm sorry. I don't know what happened," he said. At that moment, the tension that had been silently rising inside me eased. We both sat in silence for a while, my pulse slowing down but my heart still beating fast. I felt a secret sense of relief that he was backing down, but there was another part of me that I didn't want to admit, disappointment. I gathered myself together and asked him, "Should we talk about what happened?" I asked. "But do it for me, not for yourself," I said. Mason didn't answer immediately, but after a while he admitted slowly, "Yes, maybe you're right." However, there was a tone in his voice that made us feel that we could not solve this issue that easily. The silence between us was getting longer, making the air thicker with every second that passed. Television was failing to capture my attention. As Mason's words and touch kept repeating in my mind, my own reaction joined the cycle. Disturbingly, there was a part of me that wished he would go further, and I couldn't shake the thought. Even though I hadn't done anything wrong, I knew a line had been crossed between us that shouldn't have existed. Emotional boundaries were as real as physical ones, and we crossed a boundary that should not be crossed. "I'm going to clean the kitchen," I said, standing up suddenly. I needed to move, put some distance between us, at least for a little while. Mason said something, but I didn't stop and listen. My heart was beating fast and I felt like the walls of the house were closing in on me as I entered the kitchen. I tried to distract myself with the dishes, but my mind was still on the living room, on Mason. My thoughts kept returning to E and our experiences. I had no idea how we could overcome this. While I was acting like everything was normal, I knew it wasn't normal. I heard footsteps coming from behind me. I didn't need to turn to see who it was. Mason was standing at the door. "We need to talk," he said softly. I turned around and said, "I don't think we need to talk." He sighed and I could hear the disappointment in his voice. "We can't pretend this never happened," he said. "That's exactly what we'll do," I said firmly. When I finally turned to him, I tried to look him in the eye and force myself not to step back. But it was really hard to do, because there was a fight on his face. I could tell he wasn't going to give up. He took a step closer and said, "Why are you so afraid to confess?" he asked. "Why is it so hard not to accept that there is something between us?" "Because it's wrong," I said, my voice shaking. "We are considered family." "We're not really family, Lisa," Mason replied sarcastically. "We didn't even grow up together, we just met a few years ago." "It doesn't matter," I said. "We live together now, our parents are married, and we have to be like siblings." He looked into my eyes for a long time, as if he was looking for my answer. The same contradiction was going on in his mind. This was no longer just about the two of us. The consequences were about what could happen if we gave in to our feelings. "I understand," he said softly, but he couldn't deny the feeling in his eyes. "I can't act like I don't feel anything for you." I was afraid to confess because it would affect not only our relationship but also our lives. "We can't do this," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "It would ruin everything." Mason took a deep breath and shook his head slowly, but I could see the disappointment in his eyes. "Yeah, I don't want to ruin anything. I just didn't think I'd feel this way," he said. I didn't want to hurt him, but at the same time I couldn't continue this situation. I had to stop it to avoid chaos. "We should stop at this point," I said, my voice harsher. "Anyway, it's nothing concrete. Maybe it happened because we were stuck in the same house for a long time. Once you relax a little, everything will return to normal." Mason was silent for a moment. I could see the conflicting emotions on his face. Finally he nodded, but it was a reluctant assent. "Okay," he said, stepping back. "I don't want to disturb you." At that moment, I released the breath I was holding without realizing it. A feeling of relief washed over me, but it was overshadowed by a deep uneasiness. I had hoped things would get simpler, but I wasn't sure anymore. "Thank you," I said quietly, but my voice was straining. I forced a smile, but it was nothing but empty. Mason turned to the door and hesitated for a moment. "I think I misunderstood some things," he said. "Okay," I said, but we both knew this wouldn't be easily forgotten. He took one last look at me, then walked out of the kitchen. As soon as he left, I leaned against the counter. My head was spinning. I had stopped what was happening between us, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. There was still something unresolved between us, and as much as I wanted to act differently, I knew it was best not to pursue it.